is the weighted sum of war deaths, war injuries, progress towards peace, and levels of conflict. And what you see, even in the raw data presented here, prior to the benefit of statistical analysis, a very visible covariation in the progress towards peace and drop in violent conflict, varying with the number of people collectively meditating in this densely populated social environment. The statistical significance of this scientific finding that there was markedly reduced in violence, crime, war deaths, war injuries, when the people in society were less stressed and increasingly calm. This phenomenon was statistically significant at better than 1 part in 10,000, which in the social sciences is a rare and highly rigorous scientific finding. We'll come back to other studies of this type and discuss more the detailed mechanisms of how this works, but I just wanted to indicate that it is well known today that mounting religious, political, and ethnic tensions drive terrorism and violence, and that it is possible to reduce such societal stress and quell violence and even open warfare in war-torn areas. And again, we'll talk about the principles of this in a moment because it's extremely fascinating and very important. But I should just begin by saying it is not necessary even to eliminate societal stress completely to reduce the incidence of violent conflict. There is a phase transition in the functioning of society, which is a many-body system. It's a collective system, when the stress or entropy or chaos drops below a certain critical threshold. It is just like water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't boil at 211. So if you have a pan of milk on the stove and the temperature reaches 212 degrees and the milk starts to boil over, it can be very difficult to control the boiling over of the milk, to contain it just by trying to hold the lid on it. But instead, a more experienced cook would take the lid off and sprinkle a few cool drops of water on the surface of the milk. Suddenly, the entire bubbling cauldron settles down. The boiling subsides. That's not because the milk suddenly has become cool, just that it's dropped slightly below the boiling point. Milk doesn't boil at 211 degrees. So even if you can reduce societal stress to a certain degree, you can put a lid on war. There comes a point in the dynamic of society where the desire for revenge and retaliation becomes so intense that an act of violence almost always leads to a retaliatory act. In that circumstance, you are in an equation of escalating social violence, where one act leads to another, and that leads to a third. In a society that is a bit less stressed, so that an act of violence does not always result in a retaliatory act, that tips the balance of the equations and casts you in a situation of decreasing or de-escalating social violence. So it's not necessary to eliminate societal stress to eliminate the outbreak of war. It's just sufficient to reduce stress below the boiling point to tip society into a more coherent, more favorable phase transition where that type of extreme social chaos, the outbreak of war, simply doesn't occur. This was a very heuristic understanding of the very simple idea of diffusing the very cause of war, mounting societal tensions between rival factions, diffusing the very cause of war by targeting and neutralizing the negativity, the enmity, the stress and the strife that drives violent conflict. Until you do that, negotiated treaties and diplomatic settlements are not worth the paper they're written on. Because these paper treaties among elected representatives of rival factions historically don't hold. The ceasefires don't hold for more than a day or so, in the Middle East, for example. Not as long as the people themselves, the citizens of these rival factions, are seething in the desire for vengeance and retaliation. It's impossible to control the behavior of the people through a paper treaty. We need a more foundational approach to preventing war that gets to the cause of war, the enmity, the hatred, the societal stress and tensions that can be effectively neutralized with remarkable effectiveness, I would say, as we will see, through a scientific approach to dissolving individual and societal tensions. So this is a very simplistic introduction, but a valid analysis of what is taking place. I'd like to discuss, since we are scientists, a much more complete and I think profound understanding of the dynamics of consciousness, particularly the collective consciousness of society, so we can better understand the uncanny effectiveness, according to research, of this effect of preventing violent conflict, and thereby ultimately perhaps putting an end to this institution of war and reliance on weapons of mass destruction. In order to understand the dynamics of collective consciousness responsible for the spreading of social coherence and the prevention of violent conflict, we need to understand consciousness a little bit better. And for this, we need to understand the latest discoveries of the physical universe in which we live. And for those of you who are not physical scientists, let me take a moment to review the most up-to-date understanding of the structure of the physical universe. And on the basis of understanding the structure of the universe in which we live, we can understand really for the first time the nature and origin of consciousness and the dynamics of collective consciousness. This first chart summarizes 50 years of scientific progress, particularly in the field of physics, elementary particle physics, and quantum field theory, and it shows the structure of our universe as comprised of layers of creation, from superficially diverse at the top of this chart to fundamentally unified at the foundation of this chart. This chart shows a hierarchical structure of natural law from fundamental unity to surface diversity. At the surface of the chart is the classical world of macroscopic objects. As you go more deeply into the layers of this chart, you come to the molecular, atomic, nuclear, and subnuclear levels of nature's functioning, each corresponding to smaller time and distance scales. Towards the bottom of the chart, you see the four forces of nature on the left, the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces, plus gravity, and the particles on which they act. On the right-hand side of this chart, the up and down quarks, the charged and neutral leptons. The Nobel Prize was awarded some 30 years ago almost now for understanding that this surface complexity, the multiplicity of forces and multiplicity of particles at the nuclear level, gives rise to fundamental, or gives way to fundamental simplicity at more fundamental space-time scales. In particular, it shows at the next subtler or deeper level of the laws of physics, the electroweak unified level, 100 times smaller than the atomic nucleus, a phase transition occurs in the structure and function of natural law, whereby two superficially diverse forces, the weak and electromagnetic forces, are understood to be fundamentally one. And in the same stroke of unification of two of the four forces of nature, we see a simultaneous unification of the different particle types of nature, a unification of up and down type quarks, and a unification of charged and neutral leptons, leading to a more fundamentally unified, simpler level of understanding of natural law. And the profound success of this Nobel Prize-winning electroweak unified theory led theorists to rapidly construct grand unified theories of the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces. And within the past decade, since the so-called superstring revolution, ultimately the fulfillment of Einstein's lifelong dream, the discovery of completely unified field theories in which all the fundamental forces on the left-hand side of this chart and all the particles of nature on the right-hand side of this chart, all of these are understood as one, just different vibrational degrees of freedom of what are called superstrings, excitations of a universal, unified superstring field. If I can be slightly didactic about it, superstring theory describes the entire universe and everything in it, all the elementary particles, and all the forces of nature. All of these Bose and Fermi fields, all these particles and forces are just different states of vibration of a fundamental field of unity, like little ripples on the surface of an unbounded ocean of existence. Little ripples or energy eigenstates of this universal field or superstring field. Superstring theory thereby locates the unified source of all the diversified laws of nature that uphold the universe at every level: nuclear, atomic, molecular, macroscopic, planetary, astrophysical, cosmological scales. All this total range of natural law has a unified source in the unified field. And unified field theories of quantum physics also lay out the sequential process of diversification, the so-called process of spontaneous symmetry breaking, in which fundamental wholeness, fundamental unity, sequentially gives rise to surface diversity. I want to emphasize before I move on that this discovery of the unified field has far more than philosophical influence. The unified field, for example, in this chart, is described by an extremely compact formula, the Lagrangian of the superstring, at the very top of this chart. And I show this rather simple formula to emphasize that this is not a philosophical discovery, but a precise and mathematical reality, which is a great mathematical triumph in its own right. It took 50 years for physics to discover, to construct a viable theory of gravity. Sure, there were classical theories of gravity, Einstein's gravity, before him Newton's laws of gravity, but even almost from the very introduction of Einstein's general relativistic field equations, it was known from the beginning that this phenomenon of curved space-time was incompatible with quantum mechanics. That space-time could have a definite shape, curved or flat, violates the uncertainty principle, which is a principle really of non-specifiability, or an all possibilities quality to the laws of nature, which would resist the limitation of space to any one shape. So it was necessary from a very early time to update Einstein's general relativistic field equations, Einstein's theory of gravity, to be consistent with quantum mechanics. And that was no small task. 50 years of trying to construct point-particle theories of the gravitational force through a spin-tube graviton particle resisted quantization because such early attempts at a quantum theory of gravity were beset by what are called infinities or divergences and were ultimately mathematically inconsistent. The superstring theory eliminates fundamentally these gravitational infinities or divergences, giving us a mathematically finite and sensible theory from the beginning. We could discuss, perhaps, if there's interest at some later point, why string theory avoids the pitfalls of earlier attempts to quantize gravity, but the important thing is that it works and that it is unique, essentially unique. That superstring theory is a quantum mechanically consistent, mathematically consistent theory of gravity. And that in itself was an absolutely essential triumph, allowing us to wed for the first time the physics of the very large, including the curvature of the universe itself, with the physics of the very small, the world of the quantum. So superstring theory, as we see from this formula, has a very precise and really unique mathematical structure. And more important, superstring theory predicts the stage-by-stage emergence of the more diversified levels of the laws of nature. As this chart shows, the top equation of superstring theory leads to the Lagrangian of n equals 1 locally supersymmetric grand unified field theory, or grand unification for short, which is certainly a much longer formula. Only a tiny fragment of it has actually been presented here for reasons of visibility, legibility. But it is a rigorous derivation which shows the emergence of grand unification from the fundamental field of unity, the field of superunification, and like that, stage-by-stage emergence of the diversified structure of natural law from the field of fundamental unity. This is vitally important for many reasons, because prior to the discovery of the superstring, prior to the discovery of the unified field, grand unification was a matter of guesswork. The whole of physics was a path of exploration from the superficial to the profound.